We humans can't hear anything above 20 kilohertz, and that is if we're lucky. So why bother with high-resolution audio? Welcome to Q&A Wednesday number 2. Today we're talking about high-resolution audio, when it matters, why it matters, and when it doesn't matter at all. So let's go through the production process, starting at the recording side. So let's say we're making a recording at 44.1 kilohertz, and we want to have as much audible bandwidth in it as possible. So let's say we're going up onto 20 kilohertz. The Nyquist theorem tells us that we can't have any signal above 22.05 kilohertz in the signal before it enters the A to D stage. Otherwise, you'll get aliasing. Now, there's two ways to solve that. We can either use a relatively slow filter, but start filtering in the audible spectrum as well, so you'd get less high-frequency content. Or you could use a brick wall filter, as they're called. A brick wall filter is something that keeps everything through at, let's say, 20 kilohertz, and then drops off super quickly until it reaches, let's say, minus 96 decibels on 22.05 kilohertz. That would be ideal, but no filters are ideal. Filters can introduce some non-linearities to it, some pre-ringing, some post-ringing, some temporal distortion, as we like to call it. Generally, the steeper these filters, the more of these distortions that they bring about. And that's something that we don't want in any recording. Otherwise, you could also use a very slow filter and just start filtering from the audio bandwidth. So let's say we're starting at 10 kilohertz already. But then you're losing a lot of high-frequency content. That's also something that you don't want. So the way that we do it here at TRPTK, we just record at very high resolutions at 352.8 kilohertz, and we use very, very slow filters that introduce as little distortion as humanly possible. And for us, that's really important. We as humans are temporally very sensitive, and in our experience, it really helps a lot using slow filtering with a high sample rate. Then, and that's a more personal thing for me as a producer, there are lots of instruments that record stuff way above 20 kilohertz. A piccolo flute, string instruments, percussion, cymbals especially, produce a lot of content above 20 kilohertz. Now, it's my belief at TRPTK that I'd like to just record it anyhow. Even if you don't hear it, let's just make sure that it is there in the recording, that whatever we want to do with it, it is there. It's always better to have it and not use it than to need it and not have it, right? So now that everything's recorded, let's go to the mixing and mastering stages. Now, it's not really applicable to TRPTK, but in a lot of pop music studios, they tend to use auto-tune and Melodyne and those kind of pitch correction tools. And the more information that you record there at the higher resolution, the less artifacts you get there as well. And it's actually very simple. Giving these algorithms just more information to work with results in a better, cleaner, and more natural sound. But again, we at TRPTK don't use any Melodyne or auto-tune or stuff like that, so let's move on to the next one. Aside from pitch correction tools, studios also like to use compression and limiting sometimes. These are dynamic tools that help bring the dynamic range of a certain recording up to about a level that you would want it to be, or something that feels comfortable to listen to. Now, we also don't use it that much at TRPTK. For classical recordings, we don't use it at all, and for jazz, we use it very sparingly. But still, I wanted to have it said. Compressors and limiters can also introduce some non-linearities to the audio as well. In a 44.1 kilohertz system, we've noticed that they actually fold back over Nyquist back into the audible spectrum quite a bit. And that's something that introduces distortions and noise and all that kind of stuff that you don't want. And by working at higher resolutions, you can actually bring these into a frequency bandwidth that you just can't hear. So on the mixing side of things, this is really a great benefit for high-resolution audio. Now, I do know that some of these compressors or limiters have oversampling options, such as the ones that FabFilter uses. This oversampling works in a way that before the music hits the compressor itself, they upsample it 2 times, 4 times, or even 8 times to a super high resolution, do its work from there, and then bring it back to the resolution that you're working at. And this in itself should be really great, right? You get rid of a lot of the nasty stuff that's happening above the audio range, you don't get any aliasing, sounds perfect. The thing is that this conversion, though, is never always exactly perfect. It just can't be. We don't live in a perfect world like that, unfortunately. So these non-linearities add up as well, especially if you use a lot of them. Now again, we don't use a lot of compression and certainly no limiting, But it is good to understand that high resolution does have a good benefit for mixing and mastering, especially in pop and rock productions, actually. Finally, when everything's mixed and mastered, it's time for playback, right? It's what you do as a listener in your living room. And here I have to say it matters a little bit less. Once the recording is done well, you can use good offline sample rate conversion software like we use the Wise Seracon and play back at a good resolution, keeping a lot of details. And on most systems, you wouldn't hear that much of a difference. That being said though, on some systems you do, and some people do. Some people also don't. What we actually notice a lot is the musicians that we get over here have such a great hearing that they hear the differences between these high resolutions and lower resolutions that we work at. It's really interesting, but I think it has to do with the fact that musicians are trained to listen to themselves every single day, and they tend to listen very well and very detailed. But let's go back to the playback for a bit. I think the most important thing here is that you choose the format that works best on your system and with your ears as well. If your system sounds best at 44.1 kilohertz, especially if the master is converted well from a high resolution master to a 44.1 kilohertz master, that's all great. If your system or if your preference sounds better at higher resolutions, do choose that. Absolutely do. There is one pointer I can give you though, and that's to try and limit yourself to as little resampling as possible. Because again, no resampling is perfect, and we've seen some amazing applications, and Grim Audio, for example, has been doing a terrific job at upsampling in their Mu1 streamer. But not a lot of streaming software does this perfectly, and so if you resample your masters as little as possible, from the mastering stage to the playback stage, you get to keep as many details as you can. And that is, I think, what you want in the end. I think in the end, you want to hear what we as a producer or the musicians intended with the music and intended with the master for you to hear. And by listening to something that's been converted back and forth and up and down for as many times as sometimes happens, you listen to something that maybe we, the producer or the artist, didn't intend for you to hear. And that's unfortunate. Finally, some closing thoughts. Number one, 44.1 kilohertz recordings can actually sound really great, so don't worry about that. CD quality is still a really great quality to have, and there's a reason why they set the resolution for CD at 44.1 kilohertz. It can sound great, especially when derived from a high resolution master, I have to say. Will you hear the difference though? That is up to you. That's up to you and your system as well. Will your system be able to show these differences? Will your ears be able to pick it up? That is all up to you. Again, when we get artists over here at the studio, a lot of classically trained artists can actually hear the difference between these formats. But I think that has to do with them having great ears and great training for these ears as well. Number two, we're talking a lot about filters and artifacts and nonlinearities and stuff, but will you be able to hear that? Well, that's up to you. But it's also up to the music that you listen to. Some music is just so complex and features so many distortions already in the music or in the instruments or in the recording or the production process that you just don't hear these things anymore. Try to just enjoy what you have. And this brings me to my last point. Try not to get fooled by big numbers such as DXD and DSD. I know that we presented to you as well, high resolution and everything. But in the end, it's really not about the numbers. It's about the music. Right? What are you listening to? To a bunch of numbers or to a great symphony being played by a fantastic orchestra or a beautiful chamber piece? That is what it's really all about. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts in the discussion down below. Please try to keep it civil. If you can't keep it civil, we have to block you or remove the comment. Please let me know your thoughts. We're really curious what you think of it. And also if you have any other questions for our next Q&A. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers.